Hi everyone, my name is Ike Check and I make my own clothes. I recently made myself a pair of white hemp canvas fatigue style trousers and I have just enough fabric to make myself some sort of matching jacket. As far as the design goes, I was really inspired by the P-41 jacket that was issued to the US Marine Corps in the 1940s. I love how kind of square and boxy it's cut, and also how simply it's constructed with the patch pockets and the convertible collar. I was also really inspired by the dungaree jumper that was issued to the US Navy in the 1940s. Again, it's got kind of a square cut, though it's a little less boxy than the P-41 jacket. And again, the construction is really simple on it. Patch pockets, it doesn't have any sort of closure at the cuffs either. It just has facings. I like the shawl collar on it, but I do think I'm going to do a convertible collar. I actually made one of these jackets for myself last year, and so I've got a pattern to start from. I don't find myself wearing it all that much, and I think it is because of the shawl collar, so that's why I really want to do a convertible collar on this one. First step, of course, is laying and cutting everything out. I've got the fabric doubled here, folded selvage to selvage, and I'm just using some heavy objects from around my apartment to hold down the pattern while I run around it with some chalk. Like I mentioned, I based the pattern off of one I did for a jacket I made last year. I didn't do all that much to it. I drafted new sleeves, tweaked the armhole shape a little bit, did a new collar, and used the pockets from the fatigue pants I just made. One of the bigger changes I made was cutting the front facings in one with the rest of the fronts versus like having a separate facing that seamed on. I did this partially because I haven't done it before and I thought it'd be fun to try something new. But I also thought that it might save me just a little bit of fabric because I really wasn't working with all that much here. I think I had maybe a yard and a half, so I definitely had to make some compromises. I cut the sleeves on the cross grain, which, since this is a plain woven fabric, shouldn't be that big of a deal. I also had to use some larger scraps to cut out pockets and the collar. Um, I did have to put a seam at the center back of the undercollar just to make sure I could get everything out. Like I mentioned, the fabric is the same 11-ounce hemp canvas that I used for the fatigue style pants I made in my last video. It's really beautiful stuff. I got it from Hemp Traders. It's a little bit spendy, but the quality is really nice. Uh, like I mentioned in the last video as well, cutting this out felt a lot more difficult than cutting like a cotton denim. And I think it is in part due to the fact that hemp has a really high tensile strength. So it's a lot stronger of a fiber. I think hemp is such a cool fabric and fiber. It's really similar to linen, both visually, it sort of looks like linen. It's got the same sort of slubs and it wrinkles, just like linen does, and also sort of functionally. So hemp and linen are both really good conductors of heat. And also they wick moisture really well, which makes them great for summer clothing. And one of the reasons they're so similar is they're both what are known as bast fibers, meaning they're the phloem of their respective plants, basically the plant's vascular system meant to transport soluble nutrients. With everything cut, I can start putting this thing together, and I'm actually going to start with the front facings because I want to put the buttonholes in. And the first thing I'm going to do is turn and press the seam allowance to the wrong side of the front. You can see I've chalked a line that I'm pressing to. That's the way I found it's easiest for me to turn and press a consistent seam allowance. And then I could turn the whole facing to the wrong side. I honestly found figuring out where the center front edge needed to go a little difficult. Here at the bottom where everything is straight and parallel, I just used a ruler, but then it curves up towards the neckline. So then I matched the neckline and just pressed everything out. Having a seam down facing would have been a lot easier. I also think having the seam allowance at the center front would have provided a little bit more stiffness and reinforcement to that front edge. I don't think that just having the two layers of hemp will be an issue, though. I had to go back a couple times with a ruler just to make sure that front edge was as straight as possible, pressing everything out. to get a nice clean front edge. Before I stitch those facings down, I'm going to deal with the part of the neckline that's not covered by the collar. My collar sits about an inch back from the center front, so I'm just marking that out with chalk. And then I'm going to sew the collar on with 1/2 inch of seam allowance, but I'm only measuring and marking down 3/8 of an inch here. That way, when I sew the collar on, it'll sit down onto the body just a little bit. And then I'm just going to clip into the seam allowances down to that mark through both layers of the facing. And then I can open up the facings and turn the seam allowance in between those two clips and press it. You could totally seam and turn this part here, but I found that you get a sharper corner doing it this way. And then I'm going to top stitch from the neckline all the way down the center front edge. And I'm actually starting in the seam allowance of the neck just to make sure that those stitches disappear under the collar for top stitching to close off the bit of the neckline that's not covered by the collar, and then stitching all the way down the center front down to the hem. I'm doing this work from the exterior. You can see as I'm stitching, the front edge is sort of rippling. I think maybe my tension was maybe a little high. I also think that having a seam down facing with the seam allowance here would have helped as well, or just interfacing this facing. But I pressed it out afterwards and everything seems to be fine. So I don't think it was a huge deal. And then I turned the fronts over and I'm just stitching down the other side of the facing. You can see I started in the seam allowance of the neck again, just so the stitches disappear under the collar, and then just stitching all the way down that front facing, following right along the folded edge. I put some pins in just to make sure nothing moves at all. I found that hemp, just like linen, can sort of shift as you're working with it. You can see I've gone ahead and cross-stitched my initials into the front facing here. I cross-stitch my initials into every garment I make. I do this by hand in silk thread. And then I'm going to go ahead and mark out my buttonholes. I think I spaced these about 3.5 inches apart. And then I'm just making sure those are square to the center front edge using a clear gridded ruler. And then I wanted the buttonholes 1/2 inch back from the center front. So again, just using that clear ruler to mark out 1/2 inch. And then I knew I wanted my buttonholes to be 3/4 of an inch long to accommodate my buttons, which are 5/8 of an inch wide. And then I do all of my buttonholes by hand. So I went and sat outside by the lake and did them. It was an absolutely beautiful day. And I think this is really one of the big advantages of hand sewing is that you can do it outside. I'm working these buttonholes in a heavy linen thread over an even heavier hemp cord. I'm planning on doing a whole video on how I hand sew buttonholes, but I'm sort of waiting until I can monetize that video. I'm getting really close, so the video will probably be out in the next month or two, so stay tuned for that. Here's a close-up with how they turned out. Honestly, I'm really happy with them. I love how the hemp cord makes for kind of a really chunky 3D buttonhole. With the facings done, I'm going to start working on the pockets. I'm turning and pressing in the seam allowance on the top edge of the pocket. I used a 1/4 inch of seam allowance here. Doesn't really need to be any wider than that. And then I just turn that whole edge in the width of the facing that I patterned. In my case, I think that was 1.25 inches. I'm just using a ruler to measure down the length of the thing. And the nice thing about hemp is that it creases sort of like paper, so I just use my hand to sort of press that in place before going in with an iron. And then I'm going to put in some top stitching. I'm doing the first line from the wrong side right along that folded edge to hold it in place. And then I flip the whole pocket over and put in a second line of top stitching right along the top edge. And then I turned and pressed in the seam allowances around the other edges of the pocket. And then something I like to do is on the top edge here, I like to give the seam allowance an extra turn and press that. It creates a little bit more bulk, but I think it gives a cleaner look since the seam allowance isn't sticking out of the top edge. And then I can get those pockets in position on the front. I had drawn out where I want them on my pattern, so I'm just transferring those measurements over with a ruler. I sort of wish I would have placed these pockets a little bit lower. On some of the vintage examples I referenced, the pockets seem to be really close to the hem. I suspect they're actually put on after the hem was done. But I really like putting my pockets on at this stage when the garment is still flat because it's a lot easier to maneuver underneath the machine than a whole garment. Once I was happy with where those pockets were, I just put in a few pins so it wouldn't move while I was sewing it on. And then I can go ahead and top stitch those pockets on. I'm putting this first line of stitching just inside from that folded edge. I find the closer I get to that edge, the more professional it looks. I'm using a Tech 60 cotton wrapped poly thread for all of the machine sewing on this jacket. I wanted to mimic the look of a double needle machine, so I'm going in with a second line of stitching. I'm just using the left side of my presser foot as a guide to maintain a consistent spacing. And then at the top corner of each pocket, I'm just going to stitch back and forth a few times at an angle to sort of mimic a bar tack and provide some additional reinforcement in this area. With the pockets on, I can join the fronts to the backs at the shoulder seam, and I'm going to do these with a flat felled seam. The way I like to sew my flat felled seam starts by positioning the pieces with the wrong sides together and pinning them. And then I'm going to go ahead and stitch those. I'm using a 3/4 inch seam allowance for all of my flat felled seams. It's definitely a little bit wide, but I found that the wider seam allowance is really helpful when you've got really bulky areas like flat felled seams on top of flat felled seams. And then I'm going to go ahead and trim just one of my seam allowances in half or just under half. And you want to trim the seam allowance in the direction that you want the flat felled seams to go. So in my case, I wanted the flat felled seams to point towards the back, so I'm trimming the back seam allowance. And then I can turn the untrimmed seam allowance over the trim seam allowance, stopping that edge just inside my first line of stitching, and then I'm going to press it. And then I press everything flat and the seam open. I find it's easiest to do that from the wrong side, just making sure those flat felled seams are pointing in the right direction. And then from the right side, I can put in a second line of top stitching right along that folded edge to finish off that flat felled seam. I'm going to work on the collar next. It's a pretty standard convertible collar. You can see I had to piece together what's going to be the under collar with the seam at the center back. The first thing I'm going to do is turn in and press the seam allowance along the bottom edge of what's going to be the upper collar. And then I'm going to position the two collar pieces with the right sides together and that pressed in seam allowance I just did facing up. Matching all the edges, I'm just going to put in a few pins to make sure that nothing moves while I'm stitching these together. And then I can go ahead and stitch those together all the way around the sides and the top edge. I started about a 1/4 inch up from that folded edge at the bottom there, just because when I sew on the collar, it's going to sit down onto the body a little bit, like I mentioned when I was working on the facings, and I want to give just a little bit of room for that to happen. Before I turn out the collar, I like to clip the corners and press the seam allowances open all the way around the sides and also the top edge. This point presser comes in really handy. I got this one at an estate sale. I find turning a collar and getting a sharp corner to be really kind of tricky. I used a paintbrush to help poke out the corners. I also went back and trimmed my seam allowances down to a 1/4 inch. I sort of just wish I would have sewn them at a 1/4 inch. I also found using a seam ripper to help sort of tease out the corners a little bit to be helpful. Um, and then rolling it back and forth and sort of mashing the corner helped as well. I did a lot of work with the iron. I find it's a little easier to manipulate it if it's sort of warm and steamy still. Before I attach this, I'm going to mark out where the shoulder seams are, just to make sure that everything is evenly distributed. And then I can pin the collar onto the body. I'm doing this with the right side of the undercollar against the right side of the body, matching up the center back of the collar with the center back of the jacket. And then I'm going to match and pin the shoulder seams with the chalk mark I just put in, doing that on both sides. And then I can match the center fronts next and pin those before putting some pins in between the rest of the pins just to make sure that everything is again evenly distributed. And I'm just pinning the undercollar to the body of the jacket. This is one area I definitely advocate kind of using a lot of pins, spacing them close together. There's a lot of complex curves there, and it really helps to make sure that everything is smooth. And then I can go ahead and stitch that collar on. Again, I'm using 1/2 inch of seam allowance here. I'm going pretty slow just to make sure that those edges are matched and everything is laying smooth. Sometimes I like to put my hand underneath the collar just to check that there's no puckers forming on the body that I can't see. But yeah, just working my way around the neckline, manipulating the body of the piece as needed to make sure that everything is nice and smooth. And then I can go ahead and press that seam allowance up towards the top edge of the collar. I'm doing this from the exterior or right side of the jacket. I've got a tailor's ham underneath here. It just makes it a little bit easier to navigate some of those curves. It also just gives me a little bit of an elevated surface to work on. And then I'm going to flip it over, and the collar really should just sort of fall into place at this point. But I'm going to go in and just give it an extra press, make sure that folded edge is in the right spot. I want it to just cover that first line of stitching. And then I'm also double checking that this all worked here. You can see what I was talking about with that collar sitting down onto the body just a little bit, making sure that looks all right, and that turned edge is pressed in nicely. And then I went in with a line of basting stitches right above the seam allowance just to hold everything in place. You could totally use pins here, but I found that basting just gives me a little more peace of mind that nothing is going to move. It also gives me another chance to double check that that edge is in the right position. I've also found that basting lays a lot flatter than pins do, which I think is an advantage, especially when you're top stitching. And it also really doesn't take that much time to run a quick line of basting along this edge. To finish off the collar, I'm just going to top stitch right along the neckline. I'm doing this from the upper collar side, and I like to start and stop on top of one of the shoulder seams. That way it's a little bit less noticeable where I do. I'm also top stitching the center front edges and the top edge of the collar as well. And that's the collar on. You can see I didn't perfectly catch the undercollar with this top stitching. It's a little bit wavy throughout. I don't think this is going to be a problem though. And then I'm going to attach the sleeves, and I'm pinning these with the right sides together. And the first thing I'm going to do is match and pin the top of the shoulder on the sleeve with the shoulder seam. And then I'm going to move to the front and match the underarm seam and the side seam and pin there. And then I'm going to work up towards the shoulder because I want the front of the arm to be really smooth. I did end up with just a little bit extra up here towards the shoulder, but I just sort of pulled the pieces to make sure that they aligned before putting in a pin. And then I moved to the back and did the same sort of thing, matching up the underarm seam and the side seam and pinning there before moving up towards the shoulder. Now, I didn't draft the sleeve with any ease in the cap, but because of the complex curves and wider seam allowances, I did end up with some. And the top of the shoulder is where having a little bit more ease is useful. To work out that extra there, I just sort of pulled the pieces again to make sure they were aligned, and then sort of evenly distributed the fullness on either side of a pin before putting in some more pins to make sure everything is smooth. And then I can go ahead and stitch those sleeves on. I'm using a 3/4 inch seam allowance here. And you can actually see I've gone ahead and chalked in my stitch line. I figured it would help me navigate these complex curves a little bit easier. And also, I wanted to make sure that I had a really smooth line over the shoulder, which I feel like is pretty visually important when it comes to a jacket. Just like on the collar, I'm going pretty slow just to make sure that those edges are aligned and so that I don't end up with any weird puckering on the sleeve head. And then I'm going to go ahead and trim the seam allowance of just the body in half or just under half, all the way around that arm's eye. And then I can turn the seam allowance from the arm over the trim seam allowance of the body and press it. Just like on the shoulder seam, I'm stopping that edge just inside my first line of stitching. It took a couple times going around with the iron to get everything to lay smooth and in the right position. The top of the shoulder, where there's a little bit more fullness in the sleeve than there is in the body, took a little bit of extra attention, but I got it to lay flat in the end. I'm pressing this on top of a tailor's ham. It helps me navigate some of the more complex curves and deal with sort of the 3D shape of the top of the sleeve. And then I turned it right side out, and I'm just pressing the seam allowance towards the body, working my way around the arm's eye. And you can see I'm not necessarily pressing it so the seam is perfectly flat. I'm sort of creating a little bit of a ridge. Again, I've got the tailor's ham underneath here. It really helps with getting that shape looking nice. It's a little bit more complex when you get around to the bottom of the arm's eye, but the tailor's ham helps, and also the fact that fabric is really moldable when you use steam and heat. So I use those to my advantage to help get that flat felled seam around the curve of the arm's eye and get everything nice and flat. The shoulder seam is pretty bulky, so I found that running my finger along it helps smooth everything out and straighten it. Before I finish off that flat felled seam, I'm just going to double check that everything is still folded and turned nicely. There was a little bit of an issue there, so I just repressed it, and everything else looked pretty good. And then I'm going to go ahead and top stitch from the exterior. I'm putting this first line of top stitching right along the seam. Now, this is not necessarily structural. It's not going to finish off that folded edge on the inside. Now, most of my flat felled seams I do on the exterior. So the first line of stitching sews the two pieces together, and then the second line of stitching catches down the folded edge to finish off the flat felled seam. But I find it easier to set a sleeve this way and then just top stitch it from the exterior. Before I put in that second line of stitching, I'm just going to make sure that everything is still folded in on the wrong side. And then I'll flip the piece around and put in a second line of top stitching, and that line of top stitching should catch the folded edge. I'm doing the second line of top stitching from the exterior as well. You could stitch it from the wrong side, following along that folded edge, but I was more confident that I would be able to get a nice, even, consistent parallel line of stitching if I stitched it from the exterior than I was if I was doing it from the interior. And I was relatively confident that it was going to catch that folded edge. Here's what it looks like from the wrong side when it's all finished. This side turned out really nice. That edge is caught down, nothing's loose. This side, there was a little bit of an issue right here, but I don't think it's going to be a huge problem. But otherwise, it looks pretty good. With the sleeves on, I'm going to sew up the underarm seam and the side seam in one go. I'm going to do these with a flat felled seam, just like the shoulder, so I'm pinning it with the wrong sides together. I like to match that flat felled seam at the arm first before pinning and matching the hem, and then working my way up towards the sleeve. And then I can match the cuff and pin that before working my way towards the arm's eye. And then I can go ahead and stitch up the side seam and the underarm seam in one go. I'm using a 3/4 inch seam allowance here, just like the rest of my flat felled seams. And then because I want the flat felled seam to point towards the back, I'm going to trim just the back seam allowance on the sleeve and the body in half or just under half. And then I can turn and press the seam allowance from the front over the trimmed seam allowance from the back, stopping that top edge just inside my first line of stitching. And then I'm going to press it flat before I take it to the machine. Again, I find it easier to press this from the wrong side. I just want to make sure that the flat felled seams are pointing in the right direction. This juncture where all of the flat felled seams meet is really bulky, so I just pressed it again. I also went back and flattened it with a hammer before I started stitching. And then I can just top stitch right along that folded edge to finish off the flat felled seam. It's pretty easy here on the body, but once I get to the arm's eye and start working my way down the sleeve, it's going to get a lot more difficult. It's definitely easier to sew it in this direction from the body to the end of the sleeve than it is to do it in the opposite direction. The reason this is so tricky is basically you're sewing on the outside of a closed tube. In order to make this work, basically I'm going to almost turn the sleeve inside out, sort of roll it into itself, and just make sure that I have everything clear underneath the needle, and I can usually get a couple more inches to sew. It only gets trickier the farther down the sleeve you go. This is right at the bottom, and you can see how tight it is, though I can usually manipulate it to just get another inch or so to be able to finish off the sleeve. Next up, I worked on the hem at the cuffs. I'm just turning and pressing in my seam allowance. In my case, that was 1/2 inch. Instead of double turning it at 1/2 inch, I actually patterned it with 1 inch wide, almost facing here. So I just turned that and double checked the width with a ruler before going and pressing that in all the way around. And then I used some pins just to make sure that this wouldn't move while I was stitching it. I could have basted it, but honestly, I was running out of steam at this point and pinning seemed easier. And then I can top stitch right along that folded edge to finish off the cuff. I like to start and stop at the underarm seam just so it's a little bit less noticeable. You can see I've got the sleeve turned so it's right side out and I'm almost stitching inside of the sleeve. That's the easiest way I found to stitch this. And then I can deal with the hem at the bottom. I'm just turning up and pressing 1/2 inch again before turning and pressing 1 inch. I made sure to turn and press the seams first, just so I could make sure that those were matched and that everything was aligned and evenly distributed. And then I could just top stitch right along the folded edge to finish off the hem. Honestly, I don't think this is some of my best work. It's not particularly even or straight, but it looks good from a distance, and that's all that really matters. I could probably go back and redo it if I really wanted to, but I was really running out of steam at this point, and it looks good from a distance, and at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. And then the last thing I needed to do was put on the buttons. I just used some chalk to mark the position, and I put a line of pins down the front to help me gauge where that center front edge should be. And then I went and sat outside and put the buttons on by hand. I used the same heavy linen thread that I sewed the buttonholes with. I've got a whole short about how I sew on buttons, and I've also covered it in other videos as well if you want to see how I do that. With the buttons all on, this project is finished, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. I think it looks absolutely beautiful. I love the cross-stitched initials, the buttonholes, and the buttons. I think it all works together really well. And here's what it looks like on with the matching fatigues that I made in my last video. Overall, I'm really happy with the fit. I think the length is perfect. Any shorter and the pockets would have been way too high. Any longer, and I think it would have looked too long. The only note I think I have is that I wish I would have brought the shoulder in just a little bit, but I don't think it looks bad. I do think that the matching jacket and pants is maybe a little bit much, but it looks great with a pair of jeans as well. But let me know what you think, and let me know if you have any questions as well.